That'll be interesting. I just got a notification on my phone is why. All right, so if you're on the temporary website, then we're in week 2. I'm going to click on the course calendar real quick and talk about what's coming up. I've been graying out the days that we have completed so that it's easy for you to find what you're looking for on these calendars. Today we're going to talk about the beginning part of Gawain. That wasn't a very difficult read. It was fairly short and you only needed to do part 1. The other part that you need to do of Gawain is part 4. For Tuesday, you can skip parts 2 and 3. I think it would be beneficial for you if I summarize parts 2 and 3 for you so that when you go to read, part 4, then it makes a little bit more sense. So we'll talk about part 1. I'll go through my notes with you on that. And then I'll take maybe 10 minutes to summarize the 2 parts that are in the interim. And then you'll have part 4 for Tuesday. Now, there is a class period tomorrow because this is a B week. So in the class period tomorrow, we are not going to be continuing with Gawain. I felt like you would need more time to read part 4. So instead, tomorrow, I'm going to talk about the first discussion board assignment, which is due in a week. So I'm going to talk about the expectations, the requirements for that. There are 12 of them. I almost said 20 and fainted. There are 12 of them during the course of the term that you need to do on Blackboard. You won't see the questions, you won't be able to have access to them or anything until Monday or Tuesday. I don't know what day they're going to open Blackboard, but I thought I would talk about it tomorrow and show you the first question so that you can start thinking about that first discussion response. I would like for everybody to, out of the gate, know what they're doing with those discussions and start off with good scores on them. So tomorrow I'm going to talk about what's expected. I'm going to give you examples of what's a high scoring discussion response, mid-range, and a low scoring one so that when you do yours, you can get a feel for the expectation level of the discussion. And I'll show you the question tomorrow. We'll talk a little bit about it. I mean, obviously, we're not going to talk about our answers to the question, but we can get a feel for it tomorrow. So that's tomorrow's session. And then next Tuesday will be the conclusion of Gawain, just so that you have a little preview there. So today we are talking about the first part of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And I'm going to switch over here to my lecture notes that I have on PDF here. You should have read the introductory material that precedes the passage. I want to highlight a few things and maybe do a little deeper dive into a couple of concepts so that you can enrich your notes on them. Notes are going to be important because the midterm, as I said, covers many terms and characters and people and texts. I was talking about that in the last class period a little bit. So there's like some short responses where they'll give you a character and you will have to explain the significance of that character to the work, to literature in general, or a term, or it could be a concept, an author, any one of those things. So in terms of reviewing, when it comes time to return review for the midterm, you'll want to have some good notes. So I just like to go through this background stuff just in case there's something that you missed in your notes that could be significant. So one of the first things that it talks about here in this background info is how the Middle Ages, we're moving ahead into the next period of time that we talk about with British literature. We were in Old English, the Anglo-Saxon period. Now we're moving into the Middle Ages, which jumps ahead in time. And so we're dealing with, sort of early, early English that you can sort of read. I'll show you, well, in the text, there was an example of what we call Middle English. And it's an improvement over Old English, but it's still kind of challenging to read. But they do talk about some of the qualities of Middle English literature that you should have in your notes. One is that there were many genres. So where we had fewer genres with the Old English, mainly they were genealogical stories, historical stories. Now there are saints' lives and romances. When we talk about romances in the course of literature, we don't mean love stories. Romance means that they're stories that have been romanticized. Romanticized just means idealized, right? So when we say that they're romances in literature, we mean that it's sort of like a perfect time. The Middle Ages and literature from the Middle Ages sort of idealizes knights and ladies and the round table and King Arthur. If we really thought about that time, you know, around 1400, 1300 in Europe, it was probably not pleasant. I mean, people didn't bathe. There's no such thing as toothpaste. Nobody knew anything about the human body, really. So there's, you know, like a misunderstanding. They didn't know about germs. They didn't know about bacteria or anything like that. So in reality, it was probably not a pleasant time to live in. But these romances sort of take all of the ugly parts away and leave all of the glorious parts. So when something's romanticized, that's what they mean. Another term that's used to describe Sir Gawain in particular is alliterative revival. And they sort of hint about it in the text, but they don't really come right out and like define what that means. So alliterative revival just means that this is a time in writing when a lot of authors went back to using alliteration like we see in Beowulf. There's a lot of alliteration in Beowulf. There's no rhyme, but instead the poets relied on alliteration to keep a poetic sound to their writing. And so Sir Gawain does the same thing, and you can look for it in the writing. There's a lot of alliteration to keep it sounding poetic. They reference the Norman conquest and expect you to understand what that is, and maybe you do. You know, if you've had European history, you might already know about the Norman conquest, but we do want to make sure that we understand the Norman conquest, you know, not necessarily historically, but linguistically. So in 1066, there's a pivotal battle called the Battle of Hastings. The Duke of Normandy, which is in the north part of France, decided to attack England. And when he did that, he was successful. And so for a period of time, you know, like about 9 years, the kingdom was ruled by a French ruler. So this means that, I mean, the king came, the duke came to rule in England, and he brought with him his language, his culture, his people, his way of dressing, his architecture, you know, all those things that come from France, and the language too. So he didn't come and learn Middle English; he came and spoke French. So there's a French influence after what we call the Norman conquest. Before that, we have this sort of barbaric society. Um, that's just sort of burgeoning and growing. And once we have the Norman conquest, we have this big influx of French words into the language, and oral poetry, and this alliterative quality to the verse. So what they're mentioning there is really just to say that this influence of the Norman conquest found its way into the literature as well. Okay, they talk about the Gawain poet and how the piece really emphasizes the chivalrous nature of the Knights of the Round Table. Maybe you've heard of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and Excalibur and all that. It's a big long story that was originally written in French. It's called Le Mort d'Arthur, the death of Arthur. But it's a British story about a British king. And so many other poets afterwards decided to write stories about King Arthur and his knights and their adventures and so on. And this is one of them. We call that Arthurian legend. And there are multiple authors, but the idea focuses on the chivalry of the characters in those stories. And by chivalry, we mean that they lived by a certain moral code. I think chivalry nowadays just sort of means manners. You know, if somebody's chivalrous, they open the door for you or they would help you carry something or, that kind of thing. But chivalry was a very specific code in the Middle Ages, and it was started actually by the church. The church wanted to civilize people. People were running wild and doing all kinds of, you know, immoral things. And so, in an effort to try to make people civilized, they instituted the code of chivalry, and knights followed it, kings and all of that. Because if that upper echelon of society is acting in a moral and honorable way through the code of chivalry, then all the rabble, the low classes or so on, if that's their role model, they might be a little better about their morals and their way of handling themselves. So the code of chivalry, and the reason I'm going on about it is because it's a big feature of Gawain and the Green Knight. I got this image that I wanted to talk about a little bit. Hopefully you can see it there on screen. But the code of chivalry had a lot of aspects to it. And in the story, the Green Knight challenges chivalry. And we'll see that as we continue to study this piece. But the idea is that someone who is chivalrous doesn't take advantage of situations. They don't attack somebody who is unarmed. They avoid cheating. They don't attack from behind. They don't torture. In terms of nobility, they have self-discipline. They obey the law. They show respect. All of those sorts of things. They protect the innocent. Their their valor is clear. They are courageous and honorable, defend the weak. All of these things are the tenets of chivalry. They always keep their word, they respect life, they exhibit manners. So you can see how in sort of a lawless society, it would be beneficial to move society forward by having a code that people could live by as as they grow as a people. And so the code of chivalry did that. And Arthur and the knights and all of that were expected to follow it at all times. So Gawain is one of the Knights of the Round Table, and he's expected to follow the code of chivalry just like everybody else. So that is going to come into play mainly in section 3, which I will summarize a little bit later. So let me see, what else do they talk about? Yeah, so this idea of chivalry is a French concept, and I think I already talked about that. I also talked about the Christian ideal of chivalry. Alliterative lines, I already talked about that. Okay, so this is an example in the text, probably you already saw this, of Middle English. And you can look at it, and you can see the word and you can see the, and you can see assault is kind of similar, was, Troy, at. So you can kind of read Middle English. It's an improvement over Anglo-Saxon because they don't have those strange letter forms that we saw, like the A and E combined and the ash and all of that. And then here's contemporary English so that there's a translation. We're reading a translated version of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight so that we can understand what is happening. They do have in the text, when we get to the Canterbury Tales, they have you reading that in an older version. So I'm going to provide for you a more modern text for that when we get to that one later next week. But anyway, you get a little view of how the language is growing. That's one of the features of this course, is to not just look at literature and how it developed, but also to look at how the language developed over time. So they have a little section there. Is there anything from that introductory material that you want me to spend a little bit more time talking about or going over? All right, then moving on to part 1. So you can maybe check your notes that you took when you were reading this section with the things that I'm going to bring up, and if you're missing anything, you can put it in. This piece starts with a reference to some stories in mythology, and the reason that they do that is to legitimize English. When English was first created as a language in that Anglo-Saxon and moving into Middle English, it wasn't considered an elevated language. Like if you were writing poetry or if you were addressing someone wealthy, you wouldn't use English. English was sort of like the language of the people. It wasn't poetic, it wasn't beautiful. So these early attempts at writing in Anglo-Saxon and Middle English are also attempts at trying to legitimize English as a language that is on par with, say, Latin or French or Spanish. So the references at the beginning to mythology are kind of like an effort to legitimize the story and say, even though this is written in English, it's still a legitimate story. Look, we know our mythology. So these characters that are mentioned about the siege of Troy and Aeneas are only mentioned to say, way after that happened, this happened with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And so they're just sort of like popping in. It's sort of like a flex a little bit, I guess is what you would say nowadays. My nephew is 15 and my niece is 12, and they make sure I keep up with all these cool kid terms. I know it's not cool at all. I don't pretend to ever be cool. All right, so I made a big note here and I put it in red because it's super significant. And I want you to write this in your notes if you haven't already. The whole plot of this story, even though it seems like a beheading death plot, is really a plot to challenge chivalry. The Green Knight's challenge about the beheading that happens isn't about the first beheading, which occurs in section 1. It's about the return of Gawain a year later, which is part of his promise. And it's about whether he's going to be loyal to that promise, whether he's going to be trustworthy through the process of that. And the Green Knight is challenging, is chivalry a thing that people just talk about, or is it real? Do these knights really act according to the code of chivalry? So on the outset, it's good to know that. So they talk about how the story is set. There's in the exposition here, they talk about Camelot, how this is King Arthur's domain. It's his fortress, and he is young at the time of this story. Gawain is his nephew. So Gawain is a member of the Round Table. He's one of the knights. And he is related to King Arthur because Arthur's sister is Gawain's mother. So Arthur is his uncle, but probably Arthur is younger than Gawain because Arthur's sister is much older than he is. I don't know if that makes sense, but in any case, there's this reference to King Arthur. If you will listen to my lay, a lay is another name for a song. So when you see that, don't get confused. It will come out also in Canterbury Tales. It's just an old term for a song. This king lay at Camelot. So Camelot, remember, is the location of the court of Arthur. And they're having their Christmas celebrations. It's Christmastide. It's after Christmas, it's New Year's, but they have like 15 days that they celebrate. So they're feasting and having tournaments and, you know, enjoying each other's company and all of that stuff there in Camelot. And Arthur says, I'm not going to eat anything until I've heard a story. Like he just wants to be the host until he hears a tale. You know, I guess it's something for them to talk about then. Guinevere's there. They're all on the dais. The dais is another word that pops up. I'm assuming that you're looking up words that seem significant if you don't know them. I think rule of thumb in reading through this material, if you're reading it and not losing comprehension, then you're probably fine. Your brain is sort of filling in whatever word might be questionable. But if you find as you're reading that your understanding of what you're reading is sinking, you know, if that's going down, then I would recommend maybe stopping and looking up a few words along the way to help you, you know, like sort of bring that comprehension level back up. So dais is a word that's used a couple times in this text, and what it means is a raised platform. So the king and the queen and those people are sitting up on a dais or a platform. At graduation, the principal and the school board people all sit up on the dais. It's still a word that we use today. Um, but it's all decorated, the castle is impeccably, you know, decorated beautifully with all these tapestries and that sort of thing. But Arthur doesn't want to eat until there's been a story. They introduced Gawain. There's a lot of imagery. There's a lot of descriptive qualities to this text. The clothing that they're wearing, especially the knights, how their horses looked, all that stuff is especially heightened. And it's to emphasize the idea that you would know a knight if you saw him, not just by his behavior and his treatment of others, but also his clothing would be of the highest standard, ideally. So they're describing dinner and everything's rare and beautiful. And in blasts this Green Knight, and he is literally green. Um, here's an image. There are lots of images. I don't think this is a super accurate image, but it was pretty clear, so I decided to bring it in today. He's green, his horse is green, everything's green, green, green. His skin is green. So when we say the Green Knight, he wasn't just dressed in green, he was green. Here's Gawain, who is at a little later point in the tale, he addresses the Green Knight, and then here's the King Arthur, and here's Guinevere. And they're like a little shocked because the Green Knight just sort of gallops his horse right into the banquet hall. There hurtles in at the hall door an unknown rider, one of the greatest on ground in growth of his frame, from broad neck to buttocks so bulky and thick, and his loins and his legs so long and so great, half a giant on earth I hold him to be. So he's huge, must be on a huge horse. He comes barreling right into the feast. And of course, everybody, stops eating and they look up. There's this description of him and his furs that he's wearing, but everything is tinted green. And there's this long description of how he looks. I think I would just note the imagery there. It's clear by what he wears that he's of a wealthy class. I don't know if that's that different nowadays. His horse is described. Even the, flowing hair that he has and the tail of his horse is impeccably combed and, just this huge description. Horses also demonstrate, like whatever steed somebody rides in the Middle Ages says something about their status. If it's a expensive horse, versus a broken down, donkey, says something about you. So a knight always has to have a well-groomed horse with beautiful ornaments. And so the horse has this bridle with jewels in it and all kinds of stuff like that. So they take note of him right away. In one hand, he has what they call a holly bob, and that's not in the footnotes. So I'll tell you that it's like a tree branch from a holly tree. Holly has little red berries on it at Christmas. So in one hand, he's got this tree branch, and then in the other hand, he has this huge axe, as you saw in the picture. And so he comes in and addresses the crowd, and they sort of like, jaw-dropping moment for them. He says, "Where is the captain of this crowd? Keenly I wish to see that sire with sight, and to himself say my say." I want to speak to whoever's, in charge, which would be Arthur, right? So they're all staring at him, and they've seen many things, but never a weird green guy on a horse in the middle of their banquet. So Arthur, there's dais again, just to demonstrate that term. Arthur stands up and he says, "Well, here I am, what's going on?" And the knight says that he's come in peace. He's not wearing armor. I'm not wearing metal. He's got this big axe, but he says, "I'm here for a different reason." And Arthur says, "Well, whatever, say your piece." And he says, to fight in good faith is far from my thought. If in any this house such hardihood claims, be so bold in his blood, his brain so wild, as stoutly to strike one stroke for another, I shall give him as my gift this gisarm noble, this axe that is heavy enough to handle as he likes, and I shall bide the first blow as bare as I sit. So if there's somebody who is, brave enough, then they can take my axe and strike me on my neck and like try to chop off my head. It's a game. And he says, but then a year from now, whoever is brave enough to do that has to come and find me, and I get to strike them. Well, that's a dangerous game. I mean, if you kill the guy, then you don't have to worry about going to find him later. But clearly, since he's green, he's got some mystical properties. So it's kind of iffy whether he's going to die from the blow. So he puts forth this challenge. And at first, they're all like silent because they don't really know what to say. And so Arthur has to step up because the Green Knight says, what, in this house of all these knights, nobody's going to take up my challenge? Like, I thought you all were noble and brave and all those things that knights are supposed to be. And so King Arthur's embarrassed and he steps up and he says, well, I guess, we'll find somebody to do it. And, he speaks back and forth with the Green Knight for a little bit, but it's determined that the king can't do this because if he's killed, then the whole kingdom is endangered. So Gawain steps up and says, well, explain it to me again, recount we our contract ere you come further. First I ask and adjure you, how are you called that you may tell me true so that trusted I may? Tell me your name and where you're from and like give me some background info before I agree to do this. And the knight says, all in good time, either do this or don't do this, right? And Gawain's like, well, where do you live? Where am I supposed to go a year from now? Like, give me the information. But the knight is kind of vague about it. So it gets down to it, and Gawain takes the axe, and the Green Knight obliges. He gets off his horse. He even pulls his hair, his long flowing green hair, up over his head and allows for Gawain to strike him on the neck. And he does, and it goes straight through. His head goes rolling. There's all kinds of blood spurting all over. And it rolls. It's funny. It's a funny line because it says that it rolled past almost everybody in the room. And he goes and gets it. His headless body walks over and picks up the head and holds it by the hair. And then the head starts talking. And that's enough to creep you out if it really did happen, right? And so he says, Sir Gawain, forget not to go as agreed, and cease not to seek till me, sir, you find. In other words, the promise is that a year from now, you're going to find me and not give up until you do find me, which is part of the chivalric code, right? That you wouldn't give up by trying to find him. Come to the Green Chapel. And that's pretty much all he tells him. Or if you don't follow through, I'll know that this chivalry is a bunch of crap and you'll be counted a recreant knight. In other words, illegitimate. That the claim of chivalry and the knights is illegitimate. So then he leaves, and now Arthur says, well, now I can eat because that was entertaining. And so that's the end of part 1. I was really just summarizing. So are there any words or references that I didn't touch on that you wanted me to talk about? Any notes that where you put a question mark or something like that? Okay, well, let me go ahead and kind of summarize part 2 and part 3 for you, so that when you read part 4, it is the continuity is there for you. So in part two, time goes by and the year passes, and it's getting close to the time when Gawain has to go and find the Green Knight and fulfill his end of the bargain. He's not happy about it, and there's this description of how things are, winding down in the season, and they're having a party, but there's sorrow for Gawain because they know he has to leave and may not come back. Maybe he's going to get killed by this Green Knight. So he gets ready, and his uncle Arthur, he talks to him and says why he's doing this, and to further the renown of the court. There's this long description of all of Gawain's clothing that he's wearing, the finest this and the most luxurious satin and silks and all this stuff, just like the Green Knight was described. And the point of that is not just to say it's describing it so that we can visualize it. Of course, that's true, but there's always a reason for that. I get a lot of commentary and responses where students kind of stop by saying, oh, well, the author just wanted you to be able to visualize it. Well, of course, but usually there's another reason why they want you to visualize it. In this case, they want you to understand that the way a knight is dressed will make them immediately obvious. Anybody seeing this guy going through the forest or through a town would know immediately that he's a knight. And it has a lot to do with their appearance. So all that stuff is described here, and he's got this horse. Oh, first they describe the pentangle that is his symbol. It's a 5-pointed star. In the text, there's an image of it. And he wears this. It's like his insignia that he wears on all of his stuff. And it's to represent the 5 senses, which all knights keep in check, the 5 wounds of Christ, and Mary's 5 joys, which are explained at the bottom of this page right here. The Annunciation, the Nativity, the Resurrection, the Ascension, and the Assumption, from biblical reference. Anyway, so he's got this pentangle, which represents his truth and his honor, and all these Christian references. By the way, I mentioned this last period, and I just want to get it out of the way because a lot of British literature references the Christian tradition and Christian concepts. When I say Christian, I mean any religion that believes that Christ is the Son of God. There's this thing that happens in the Valley, and I have never experienced it anywhere else, where people think that Catholics are not Christians. And I need to tell you that that is not the case. I guess there's a separation that the Protestant religions want to have from Catholicism. I don't really know. But to say that you're Christian means that you believe that Christ is the Son of God. Catholics believe that. Baptists believe that, Methodists believe that, all of those Christian religions are part of the Christian tradition. So when I say it's a Christian ideal, I just mean that it's that whole big group of belief systems that have the idea of Christ as the center of the Son of God. Anything else is not a Christian religion. So, Muslim, Jewish, all of those, they don't believe in Christ as the Son of God. So I'm not trying to change your viewpoint. I'm just trying to clarify that when I say Christian, I mean Catholics, Protestants, anybody who has the belief of Christ. So I want to make that clear. I've run into a few situations where people were confused about that because some of the churches here in the Valley distinguish themselves as Christian to say that they're separate from Catholics, but Catholics are Christians, just so you know. Any case, so he upholds all of those Christian ideals. He gets on his horse. His horse is named Gringolet. I didn't realize how funny that was until I moved here to have his horse named Gringolet. But one of my students made a funny joke about that one time, saying, "What is that? A white person's car, like a Chevrolet?" So it was funny. I don't think that the author of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight knew about gringos. It's not a good word anyway. So Gringolet is his horse, and that horse also is decked out with all of the same beauty as his equipment. So they describe all of that, and he sets out into the wilderness. He has a lot of battles. He battles with serpents and wolves and all kinds of wild, what do they call it? Wild men of the woods. And he survives all of that. He's depleted and tired and cold and comes near death a couple of times until he gets to a church where he pays, he's welcomed in and he prays. And almost immediately after he's done with this prayer, when he does the sign of the cross, he immediately envisions this castle and he goes to it. And it is a castle that has a host, and they welcome him in. It's a splendid palace, and of course, that's described in great detail to demonstrate the wealthy properties of those people. And if you're dressed nice, you must be a nice person, right? That would have been the belief. I don't know if that's true today, but he's brought in by the host and they describe him. He's greeted there, a lusty fellow he looked, the lord of that place, a man of massive mold and of middle age, broad, bright was his beard, of a beaver's hue, strong, steady his stance upon stalwart shanks, his face fierce as fire, fair spoken withal, and well suited he seemed in Sir Gawain's sight. So the host of the place, the master of the palace, is this sort of gruff looking guy, but he's really nice. And so they describe all the linens and the feast that they're having. They notice that Gawain must be a knight, so they praise him. And he's introduced to two women. And the reason I want to stop on that is because they feature prominently in section 4, which is the next part that you'll be reading. There's a young wife of the host, the master of the castle, and she's beautiful and fair and all of that stuff, and even maybe more beautiful than Guinevere. Ooh. But she's also a little sexy, the way they describe her. And then he also meets her companion, who is this older woman companion that she has. So he's introduced to them, and there's a lot of descriptions of their clothing. And he's given a room, and he stays there for quite a while because he is regaining his strength and also getting ready to go and find this green chapel that he has to go to. And one day he says, okay, well, I have to get going. I appreciate your hospitality. I have to go and find this green chapel. And the host says, oh, it's really close. It's just 2 miles away. You can continue to stay here. You don't have to go on another, voyage to go and try to find the green chapel. It's real close nearby. Continue to stay here. And so he says, all right, well, I'll stay until it's time for me to go. If it's only 2 miles away, that's not a long journey. So the host sets up a little game with him and says, well, if you're going to stay for a little while yet, why don't we do this? Every day I go out hunting with my men to bring back the meat for the feasts and so on. So why don't we do this? You stay, you rest, you stay in bed, relax. And, when you feel like it, come down and keep the company of these two ladies that are here. And when we convene in the evening, I'll bring everything I got, all my quarry, and you'll bring to me your quarry, whatever you received during the day, and we'll share it at dinner. So Gawain says, okay, that sounds cool. And so he says, fine. So the next day, and really part 3, you can read these if you want to. I know that I'm kind of doing spoilers. You can go and read them if you want to. They're fun to read. In section 3 is really just taken up with this little game that he's playing with the host. And so the host goes out and goes hunting, and Gawain stays, a little late in his bed sleeping. And the wife of the host comes in and slips into his bed and comes on to him. He's awake, but he pretends like he's asleep because he's trying to figure out what to do. Being a chivalrous knight, he should not take advantage of the situation. So he like pretends to wake up and, oh my gosh, what are you doing here in my bed? And reacts to her that way. And she's pretty forceful. She flirts with him and he just keeps being honorable and he says, okay, that's all fine and good. I mean, he flirts with her a little bit back, like on an appropriate level. And then he says, okay, well, why don't you go and I'll get dressed and I'll come down and, we can visit. And she says, no, you're my prisoner. And like she does this little thing where she's playing with him and he doesn't buy into any of it. He says, no, I really think you should go. I need to get myself ready for the day. And she says, well, what kind of night would you be if you didn't at least accept a kiss? And so she kisses him. She gives him one kiss. And that's it. That night, the host comes back and he shows Gawain all the things all the game that he has procured through his hunting. And he says to Gawain, so what did you gain? What's your quarry for today? And Gawain shrugs his shoulders and he goes up and he gives the host a kiss on the cheek. And that's what I got. And so he's honest and he says, that's what I got. And so it's like a little joke, inside joke sort of thing. Next day, same thing happens. Except this time, Gawain accepts 2 kisses from the wife. Yeah. At this rate, it's going to take a while if it ramps up. It doesn't though. And at dinner that night, he kisses the host twice to say, I got 2 kisses today. And the host, thinks that's hilarious and they have their feast and all that stuff. The third day, he gets 3 kisses and the host's wife has a girdle on. And I think that probably we would not use the same word girdle because a girdle is like to keep a woman in a certain shape. Like a faja would be the word for it in Spanish or here in the Valley. It's more like a belt. So she's got this green belt that she's wearing and she offers it to Gawain and she says, I want you to have this belt. Well, that's kind of like a private thing, right? Like exchanging clothes is a little intimate. And so at first he says, no, I'll take the kisses because that seems to be working out, but I'm not taking your undergarments. And she says, you don't understand. This green belt will save you when you go to meet with the Green Knight. It will protect you from him so that when he delivers his blow on your neck, then you will survive. And he says, oh, wow, okay, well, then that's a good thing for me to have. And so he does accept that from her. That night, the host comes back. He shares his quarry for the day. And he asks Gawain, what did you get today? And he gives him 3 kisses, but he doesn't tell him about the belt. He keeps that a secret. That's going to come up again in part 4. So at the end of this section, it's a pretty long section. I just kind of summarized all of the times that this lady, she tries pretty hard to entice him with her charms and her body. And I don't know, whoever had this PDF before did all this highlighting, but we're skipping over it anyway. And then at the end, he gets ready to go and leave to go and find the Green Knight at the Green Chapel. So that's pretty much the end of that section. And so the part that you're going to start reading is part 4. It's about 11 pages, I think, the ending part, but that should bring you up to date with the story. Hopefully I didn't take too long explaining it, but I know that it's not the same as like watching a video or a movie. I'm trying to be energetic, but I'm not green or on a horse. So I'm just doing my best with making it interesting. If you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat while I'm talking about tomorrow and what to do for Tuesday. So tomorrow we'll spend a little time talking about some study questions from Beowulf and a little bit from Gawain. And we'll also talk about the upcoming discussion. So I'll introduce to you those expectations and discussion question 1 so that you can start thinking about it. And then read part 4 of Gawain for Tuesday. There is a video that I think is pretty cool. I linked it here so that you could see the continuity of the whole piece. I know I probably didn't do the most complete job explaining the middle part of it, but I can see what they're trying to do with the reading list. They're trying to make things go quickly so that you have enough time to read all the material for the course. But there's a video, I don't remember how long it is. Click on it here. Usually it will say, it's like 24 minutes, but it might be cool to watch that. And it will go through all 4 parts of it. I don't think it's rated R. I'm trying to think, because there are those scenes where the wife is trying to entice Gawain, but nothing happens, so I'm guessing that it's appropriate. Hey, this is a college class, so I'll just use that. All right, I don't see anything in the chat. So if there isn't anything else, I'm going to end the class period. If you have questions or something brewing, then stick around and I'll be glad to talk to you about it. Otherwise, we have our class tomorrow at the same time. All right, I hope you all have a good day. Go enjoy the weather because it looks really nice out, if you can. I don't know, take your computer outside or something. All right, I'm gonna sign off then. Have a good day.